So, in this module, we're going to be finishing that two-part series on inequalities, this time focusing on femininities. I enjoyed the connection between the previous chapter on masculinities, opening with cheerleaders again. And so I want you to think about some of the ideas that are brought up. And for me, these just come as a list of questions. Um, how do our cheerleaders differ in appearance between women cheerleaders of yesteryear and women cheerleaders of today? And comparing the kind of modesty or the kind of dress that we see in men's cheerleaders of yesteryear and women's cheerleaders and men's cheerleaders today. Um, and then also kind of ask yourself, like, how does the level of skill compare? And um, how do we interpret the athleticism of today's cheerleaders? What are some of the ways that they're doing gender? Are they following the gender rules? Are they breaking the gender rules? Right? And then we start to move into understanding how people view um, conformity and especially nonconformity to gender differently based on whether the gender that is being displayed is a masculinity or a femininity, right? And so I like this question asking like, how do parents' attitudes towards their sons or their daughters' nonconformity differ? And by son or daughter here, I mean especially when we're talking about trans children, AFAB and AMAP, right? Assigned female at birth and assigned male at birth. And does it matter if their child is projecting femininity or masculinity, right? Which might they be more comfortable with, or which might they find to be most valuable? So these are some really interesting questions to think about. From here, I'm going to introduce a couple of different um, concepts, not all of them, but a couple from the reading. Um, and that'll be it. So hopefully everything goes well in this recording. It's going to be all audio since I'm traveling. And yeah, see you soon. Okay, so we're going to start with this discussion on balance. I look at this as a crash course on how to do gender for women. So the balance that we start out with is actually an imbalance, where we see that women who are doing too much masculinity are often met with the same or similar disapproval as men who are doing just a little bit of femininity, right? And so one of the things that we acknowledge, we recognize, is that women actually get a bit more flexibility than men when it comes to performing the gender roles of what is typically viewed as the opposite. It's not really an opposite, but for lack of a better word, the opposite gender. And um, that even if men just do just a little bit of femininity, right? They just perform a small amount of femininity, this can be met with the same kind of scrutiny as a woman who's doing like over the top masculinity or what's considered as over the top expression of masculinity. But being womanly or a womanly woman or a girly girl doesn't necessarily garner respect either. You have to walk a really fine line between the two. And this is particularly true for American society. So we get a couple of examples here, starting with the feminine apologetic, right? And so, what does that look like? It's basically this negotiation that is made where a woman is practicing perhaps a high level of masculine performance, maybe in her career, maybe in her like style, or whatever it is, in some way, right? That could be seen as encroaching upon, and this is literally what the example that's given in the text from Christmas Abbott says, encroaching upon men's territory, right? And so, in order to avoid going too far or going being outcasted or the dangers that come with dabbling too much in masculinity. These women offer an over the top feminine performance as well to show that they've got both, right? To show that they are aware of their femininity and in touch with their femininity. The quote from Abbott, again, the example of the very athletic woman who I believe she does bodybuilding or some sort of very muscly activity. You can tell I'm not a sports enthusiast in this way. Um, but she says, I know it looks like I'm encroaching on men's territory, but be assured, I know my place as a woman. Wow, what a statement, right? And that is the feminine apologetic. You're apologizing with your femininity. I think this is super interesting, not so much just for, this blatant example, but when we start looking at intersectionality and how that impacts one's ability to pull off that feminine apologetic, right? How do women of color, how do Black women compromise to appease that balance of gender and race? And can they? Then the next example that's given is one of pariah femininities, right? And so pariah femininities don't typically really practice that balance, right? In some ways, they actually have a disregard for men's attention and dominance, and that can often upset men. And this can cause some risks and some dangers that come along for those who portray that pariah femininity, right? And they are burdened with that. So even if they're choosing to ignore men, they're choosing to ignore that cap on their masculinity or performance of masculinity, they still don't win, right? They still end up in a situation where men might feel threatened or they might feel that those women need to be put in their place as a woman, as is mentioned by Abbott when we were talking about the feminine apologetic. So you can see that these are two different strategies that are on two different ends of the spectrum when it comes to how women attempt to or attempt don't attempt to balance femininity and masculinity performances. So, one of the underlying themes for both the feminine apologetic and the consequences of pariah femininities is subordination. Power is gendered and it's hierarchical. And so, in our society in particular, we can see that there is more power that is associated with masculinities. We can see that with the increased value that we have on instrumental expressions of gender, thinking about logic and rationalization and calculability and being aggressive and assertive, right? These are some of the elements of characteristics that we value most in society. And the lower level of value and power that comes with expressive roles of gender performance. So things like being nurturing and caring and so on and so forth. Now, I'm not saying that these are actually innate roles that each gender is assigned to, right? Our society has constructed it in that way that that's our expectation. I don't believe at all, and hopefully you don't either, that you are supposed to be stringently attached to those roles. But the values of those roles are often associated with our performed or our interpreted gender performance. So the arenas that are set aside for women, typically known as the private sphere, right? These are the domestic sphere things where you are, focusing your energy in the home or nearby the home, but not out in the market. That's the public sphere, which was the space that, men are supposed to occupy, are often areas and arenas of sacrifice, of being subservient, and of subordination. And so you are expected to be submissive in these roles. And the submission is supposed to happen whether or not you are performing a very feminine type of womanhood or a very masculine type. Either way, when you are encountered by masculinities among men, you're supposed to take a step back and step down. In addition, there's a global assumption that women are submitting, and not just submitting, but also supplemental to some men, right? That as you're a child and growing up, that it starts with your fathers or your brother or your uncle, right? And that eventually that expectation of submission will roll over to your partner or spouse, right? Um, so even when women are working, even when they are educated, when they have a full-time position, it's believed that their working income is going to be supplemental to a man's work and income in the household. And so I have a fun story for that. And by fun, I mean not that great. When I was living in Japan, I was the breadwinner in my household, and I have been the breadwinner in my household for some time. And my husband was working. He got a job teaching English, and it was, you know, it was an okay job, right? Um, and he had been on my health insurance in Japan when we arrived, uh, and I had to prove initially when we arrived, before he even got a job, I had to prove that he didn't have a that my husband didn't have a position before I could add him to my insurance. But if a man was adding his wife to their insurance, um, whether it was a woman who had a job or was unemployed, that was unnecessary. It was an unnecessary step. So only women adding men to their health insurance in Japan needed to do so. And then it got even more complicated because he was working and then it wasn't working with our schedule with our kid. It got even more complicated when he stopped working, right? And so you can see really clearly here that in this society, my role was expected to be one where I was supplementing him, right? Where he was expected to have like the control over our health insurance and everything like that, and have a higher level, and where mine could easily just be phased in or phased out without much consideration. So, yeah, hopefully that's a clear example of showing that supplemental, um, subordinate, and submissive role that is expected. All right, so I don't want to exhaust you with a long video or a lot of audio. So the last thing I'm going to discuss here is sexism, and we're going to look at two forms of sexism: benevolent sexism and hostile sexism. Hostile sexism is actually what people expect when they hear the word sexism. This is some aggressive effort that's being made to cause women to submit, and in particular, women who refuse to submit. And hostile sexism is often a reaction that's exhibited by men who draw their power from the entitlement of being submitted to, right? On the other end of the spectrum, we have benevolent sexism, which sounds way better, but it's still sexism. And it's actually a form of sexism that supports hostile sexism. So benevolent sexism is sexism that is actually undercover, right? It's latently under the guise of protecting women and honoring women, right? It attempts to justify women being in the back seat and being in a subordinate space, right? By supporting women or emphasizing their expected expressive roles, right? And so we're justifying that since they're in these expressive roles, that they're delicate, that they're gentle, right? They need to be cared for. They need to be protected. And so, yeah, women have to be protected, to be escorted by other men due to their smaller and more graceful bodies and personalities and their, overall delicate nature. And so obviously, benevolent sexism can lead to, right, and perpetuate hostile sexism. As your text says, they're two sides of the same coin, right? Is there chivalry, right? Is there any ability to practice chivalry without there at least being some symbolic, right? Some symbolic example or meaning of weakness there, right? Or an assumed weakness, right? Is chivalry possible without some sort of negative consequence? Even if you're saying that this is in that person's best interest, right? What are we doing here, right? How are we challenging the situation that has brought upon this belief or this feeling, right? And how is it fair, right? When we think about, having curfews for our children or who can go in public and who can't, how is it fair that women's agency and mobility ends up being limited, right? Ends up being limited and restricted while the people who actually perpetrate the violence, the harm, the danger are allowed to be out freely in the street, right? So what does that mean? That women actually have to carry the brunt of the punishment of being protected, right? And does protection then become something that is actually kind of coercive and corrupt? Right? So some things to think about. So as I mentioned, I'm going to stop here with highlighting some of the um, main concepts and looking at sexism and looking at the feminine apologetic and femininities and things like that. On the next two pages, though, I want to make sure that you pay attention to first when being a woman gets dangerous and the different types of harm that women might experience. And remember that this is just a selection of harms. Like, unfortunately, the world is a very dangerous place for women and girls, whether or not they have a guardian, whether or not um, they're outside at noon versus midnight. Um, and so pay attention here to forms of misogyny, especially looking at examples that I think are really prominent today, like incels and IPV or intimate partner violence, as well as victim blaming. And I love this new term, empathy. So look at that. And then on the last slide, or last page, you're going to be looking at the bargains with patriarchy that women make in order to strategically um, gain some of the power enjoyed by men. So, yeah, take a look at those two things. And until next time, bye.